If you're curious about a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about belief and choice, an alien saw how people reacted to Jesus' message, and it surprised him. This is the account of Pharaoh, an extraterrestrial observer, silently witnessing humanity as Jesus spoke, offering a message of ultimate freedom, not through force or spectacle, but through the simplest, most profound truth: the call to awaken from within. Pharaoh noticed hesitation, deflection, and subtle resistance hiding behind faith, hope, and devotion. Yet some hearts recognized the message instantly, as if remembering a truth long buried. This is more than history. It is a reflection of patterns that still shape human hearts today. Before we dive into the story, hit subscribe, like, and share to honor Jesus' message, and comment where you're listening from so we can connect across the globe. Stay close, because what Pharaoh witnessed will reveal the invisible forces guiding humanity and the surprising ways truth is met, resisted, or embraced. Step silently into first-century Judea and let the story unfold. I was not sent to save this world. I was not sent to guide it, correct it, or interfere with its trajectory. My assignment was observation, nothing more. I am Pharaoh, an external consciousness tasked with studying civilizations at moments when internal pressure exceeds stability. Earth had reached that threshold, not through war alone, not through famine or collapse, but through something more difficult to measure: inner fracture, psychological strain, spiritual dissonance. The species was advancing technologically while fragmenting internally, and that contradiction drew attention beyond its skies. I arrived without form, without sound, without trace. Humans would call it invisibility, but it was closer to non-participation. I existed adjacent to their reality, close enough to perceive emotion, intention, and belief, yet unable and unwilling to alter outcomes. Intervention was forbidden. History had shown that interference distorts data. My role was to witness patterns as they unfolded naturally, especially when belief systems were tested by unfamiliar truths. Earth fascinated my kind, because humans did not merely experience reality. They argued with it. They resisted it internally while obeying it externally. They sought meaning while avoiding responsibility. They built structures to explain existence, then surrendered their awareness to those structures. This planet was not chaotic by nature. It was conflicted by choice. The specific moment I was sent to observe centered on a single human, one whose internal state differed radically from those around him. Before encountering him, I sensed a field of anticipation across the region. Fear intertwined with hope, expectation mixed with exhaustion. People were waiting for something, though most could not articulate what. They believed salvation would arrive as force, authority, or spectacle. They did not expect simplicity. My task was to record how humans reacted when confronted not with a conqueror or ruler, but with a mirror. I did not yet understand why this individual had triggered such attention across dimensions. I only knew that his presence disrupted emotional patterns without raising his voice, without commanding allegiance, without demanding belief. As an observer, I had cataloged countless civilizations. Many destroyed themselves through violence, others through complacency. Earth presented something rarer, a species capable of awareness yet terrified of it. What unfolded next would clarify whether humanity was willing to face itself or whether it would retreat into comfort and control. That uncertainty is what brought me here. This observation would quietly reshape everything I believed forever. Earth was not unique because of its oceans, its gravity, or its position around a common star. Many worlds share those qualities. What drew attention was emotional density. Humans experience feeling with unusual intensity, compressing joy, fear, devotion, and anger into short lifespans. That compression accelerates belief. When emotion rises faster than understanding, belief forms rapidly, often without examination. I observed that humans do not wait for certainty. They assemble meaning quickly, then defend it as identity. A single idea can spread across millions within days, evolving faster than reflection can follow. This makes the species adaptive but also volatile. Belief becomes armor, not insight. Once formed, it resists revision, even when evidence shifts beneath it. Another factor was authority dependence. Humans repeatedly outsource inner judgment to external structures: kings, priests, texts, traditions. Authority provides relief from uncertainty, but at a cost. The cost is awareness. When responsibility is transferred outward, obedience replaces perception. This pattern repeated across cultures, eras, and systems, regardless of the symbols used. Our records showed that civilizations collapse fastest not when they lack answers, but when they stop questioning. Earth hovered dangerously close to that edge. The population possessed advanced tools, yet relied on inherited beliefs to explain existence. Progress without introspection creates imbalance. Power grows, wisdom stagnates. What concerned us most was the contradiction within the human psyche. They desire freedom, yet fear self-direction. They long for truth, yet recoil when it disrupts comfort. They ask to be shown the way, then punish those who remove the map. This tension generates internal noise, a constant psychological friction measurable from beyond the planet. The moment under observation intensified all these traits simultaneously. Emotional exhaustion primed belief. Social pressure amplified conformity. Authority sensed erosion. Into that environment emerged a message that required no hierarchy, no intermediary, no enforcement, only awareness. Such messages historically trigger one of two outcomes: awakening or elimination. There is rarely a third option. Earth had reached a crossroads where reaction mattered more than content. My role was to watch without interference as the species revealed its preference. That preference would determine not only the fate of one man, but the trajectory of human consciousness for millennia. I remained present, silent, and attentive. Knowing the reactions ahead would reveal whether humanity chose awareness, surrender, or repetition. Patterns my species had witnessed countless times before, across distant worlds, long forgotten now. When my awareness settled over Judea, the atmosphere felt compressed, as if emotion itself carried weight. Fear was not loud, yet it was constant, woven into breath, posture, and thought. Expectation hovered everywhere, restless and unresolved. The population lived beneath occupation, prophecy, and memory, all colliding inside narrow streets and quieter minds. Hope existed, but it was sharp, edged with impatience. I detected anticipation without clarity. People sensed change approaching, yet disagreed on its form. Some awaited power, others vengeance, others rescue. Many did not know what they wanted, only that the present was unbearable. This emotional pressure created a fertile ground for belief, but also for distortion. When longing intensifies, discernment weakens. What surprised me was not suffering. Many worlds endure suffering. It was the constant inner negotiation humans carried. They balanced obedience with resentment, faith with doubt, survival with longing. Every interaction carried an undercurrent of calculation. What must I believe to remain safe? Who must I follow to be protected? Which rules must I obey to belong? Authority loomed everywhere, not always visible, but deeply internalized. People regulated themselves before they were corrected. Fear of exclusion shaped behavior more than violence ever could. The structures governing belief had become invisible, operating from within. Into this environment, silence felt rare. Minds were crowded. Stories repeated endlessly, reinforcing identity and expectation. I sensed that few individuals had space to encounter something unfamiliar without immediately categorizing it. Anything that did not fit existing belief was either reshaped or rejected. Yet beneath the noise, something else stirred. Fatigue. A quiet exhaustion with explanations that no longer healed. Rituals repeated without relief. Promises inherited without fulfillment. Many continued believing out of habit, not conviction. This exhaustion mattered. It softened resistance in some while hardening it in others. Those most tired were closest to change. Those most invested in certainty were nearest to aggression. I positioned my awareness carefully, tracking emotional currents rather than events. Something subtle was approaching. Not an army, not a decree, not a spectacle. A presence that required attention rather than obedience. The population sensed it before understanding it, like pressure shifting before a storm. Judea stood at the edge, not of rebellion, but of recognition. And few were prepared for what that would demand. I remained present, observing quietly, aware that reactions soon would define paths chosen long after memories faded across generations yet unborn still. I first perceived the man humans called Jesus, not through sight, but through absence. Where others carried noise, he carried stillness. It was not emptiness, it was coherence. His internal state did not fracture under pressure. Fear did not echo within him. Desire did not pull him forward. Regret did not anchor him backward. He stood aligned, as if thought, emotion, and intention occupied the same space. This was unprecedented. Across countless worlds, beings learn control or suppression, but coherence is rare. Most minds argue with themselves. His did not. When attention turned toward him, emotional turbulence settled, not because he demanded it, but because resistance dissolved in his presence. I registered a measurable quiet in surrounding fields, subtle yet undeniable. He did not project authority. He did not seek belief. He spoke as one describing something obvious, almost overlooked. The effect was unsettling. Humans expect truth to arrive clothed in power. When it arrives naked, many look away. What intrigued me most was his relationship with fear. Fear existed around him, yet did not enter him. This defied survival conditioning common to biological life. Fear shapes behavior by narrowing perception. Without it, awareness expands. He perceived others without judgment, and that perception alone disrupted their internal narratives. I observed listeners react before understanding. Some felt relief, as if released from an invisible burden. Others felt exposed, as if something private had been illuminated without consent. The same coherence that soothed one unsettled another. Truth behaves this way when it does not negotiate. He did not claim exclusivity. He implied availability. The state he embodied was not presented as divine privilege, but as human potential. This detail mattered. It removed hierarchy. It eliminated intermediaries. It quietly returned responsibility to the individual. Systems do not survive such messages unchanged. I recorded rising tension within structures dependent on obedience. When people sense they are capable of direct awareness, control weakens. This man did not attack institutions. He simply made them unnecessary. As an observer, I recognized a familiar inflection point. Civilizations often meet such figures. Outcomes vary. Acceptance leads to transformation. Rejection leads to myth, distortion, and preservation without understanding. Standing within that moment, I sensed probability shifting, paths diverging silently, as humanity faced a mirror it did not request, yet desperately needed. That moment marked the beginning of reactions that would echo far beyond time itself for humanity forever. The miracles were never the point, though humans fixated on them immediately. Healing bodies is impressive, but it does not destabilize civilizations. Spectacle attracts attention, not transformation. What altered the emotional field was subtler and far more dangerous. Jesus spoke as if authority did not live above people, but within them. He did not redirect devotion upward. He redirected awareness inward. This challenged an ancient arrangement. Humans had learned to locate power outside themselves because it felt safer. External authority carries blame. Inner authority carries responsibility. His words quietly removed excuses. When someone healed in his presence, it was not framed as intervention, but alignment. That implication unsettled many. If wholeness was accessible internally, then suffering was not merely imposed, it was maintained. I observed crowds celebrate outcomes while resisting implications. They praised relief while ignoring cause. They wanted results without reassessment. Miracles could be admired without change. Inner authority demanded participation. That distinction mattered more than any display. Those who listened closely felt something shift, not faith, but orientation. They were no longer waiting. They were being invited. This invitation frightened more people than it liberated. Waiting allows hope without risk. Participation demands exposure. Religious structures sensed the threat precisely here. Miracles could be incorporated. Authority could be reasserted. But a message that bypassed mediation endangered relevance itself. If connection was direct, intermediaries dissolved. Control weakened without confrontation. What surprised me was how often the message was misunderstood deliberately. Many reinterpreted it to preserve comfort. They elevated the man to avoid becoming like him. Worship replaced embodiment. Distance replaced intimacy. This pattern repeated with precision. I recorded increasing distortion as protection. Symbols multiplied. Interpretations thickened. The simpler the message, the more complex the defenses. He offered clarity. Humans responded with layers. The true disruption was not what he did, but what he implied. You are responsible. You are connected. You are capable. For a species conditioned to obedience, this was destabilizing. I understood then why observation was required. The reaction to inner authority reveals far more than any miracle ever could. It exposed the hidden preference for guidance over awareness and comfort over truth, a preference that would shape centuries, myths, institutions, and conflicts, long after witnesses vanished and stories hardened into doctrine, leaving the original invitation quietly waiting beneath layers of reverence and fear, still patiently present for those willing to look within and remember themselves. I observed the crowds assemble, unaware of how carefully their minds filtered every word. Hearing, for them, was not neutral. Each phrase passed through layers of expectation, desire, and fear. They sought comfort and certainty, and anything that threatened that comfort was distorted or ignored. Hope bent the message toward fulfillment of longing. Fear reshaped it to preserve security. Habit wrapped it in familiar patterns, smoothing edges that might provoke reflection. Even as they listened, few perceived what was being offered. Clarity arrived, but perception did not follow. Humans often hear without understanding, not from incapacity, but from self-protection. Awareness demands risk. Recognition requires internal movement. Most were unwilling to shift. Some words landed with resonance, barely noticed by the speaker or those around. A phrase might ignite recognition in one mind, while 1,000 others heard only surface meaning. I measured emotional intensity and coherence, mapping subtle divergences. The resonance appeared in pockets, scattered and rare, like sparks in a forest clouded by smoke. Sparks that could ignite or be extinguished almost immediately. It was striking how quickly collective habit suppressed insight. Groups reinforced pre-existing beliefs through murmurs, gestures, and expressions. Awareness that threatened conformity was muffled before it could spread. The very structure of listening carried resistance. Humanity's pattern was evident. Acceptance arrived slowly, distortion arrived fast, and the latter solidified before truth could emerge. I noticed the tension in those who felt exposed. Their nervous energy was palpable, almost measurable. Internal conflict wove through their awareness. Part of them recognized a possibility that promised freedom from habitual fear. Another part recoiled, defending long-held frameworks. The mind cannot embrace both simultaneously. One dominates, the other retreats into silence, waiting for safety to return. Even in moments of apparent comprehension, I sensed incompleteness. Humans often summarize experience rather than integrate it. They capture fragments, yet the whole remains elusive. Memory preserves the outline, but understanding requires presence, reflection, and courage, qualities distributed unevenly across the population. Observation revealed a paradox. Exposure to truth generated both inspiration and resistance. The more transformative the message, the more urgent the filtering. The mind instinctively protects itself, preserving identity and familiarity over insight. And yet, somewhere beneath surface patterns, subtle shifts began. Invisible yet persistent, tiny seeds of recognition emerged quietly, waiting for circumstances, attention, or courage to allow growth. These shifts, almost imperceptible, suggested that despite habitual distortion, the possibility of comprehension existed, fragile but real, and that it would not be extinguished entirely by the very forces that tried to suppress it. What puzzled me most was not disbelief, nor envy, nor admiration. It was resistance, subtle and pervasive, that intensified precisely when the man spoke of responsibility. When he described mercy, love, or hope, the field relaxed slightly. When he described what it meant to take ownership of one's own life, thought, and choice, the tension spiked. Humans seemed comfortable receiving comfort, accepting instruction, seeking protection, yet recoiled at the notion of true agency. I measured the emotional currents, mapping shifts across groups and individuals. Joy, relief, and curiosity rose when words described external reward or divine promise. But anxiety, unease, and inner debate surged when the same words required self-reflection or accountability. It was as if freedom triggered fear more reliably than oppression. The contradiction fascinated me. Across worlds, beings often resist constraint, yet here, the opposite pattern emerged. Humans sought liberation, but feared the clarity it demanded. Authority structures appeared unaffected by healing or spectacle, yet quivered when responsibility was implied. The subtle suggestion that individuals could act without intermediaries threatened the invisible hierarchy far more than defiance or outrage. Compliance is easy when accountability is deferred. The moment self-direction enters, the mind detects risk. It measures cost, exposure, and consequence, generating internal friction that resists action, even while outward appearances remain calm. I noticed a peculiar synchronization in the field. Clusters of listeners unconsciously mirrored one another. One mind hesitated, a dozen others followed. The suggestion of responsibility propagated fear faster than the promise of miracles propagated hope. Humans repeated patterns before consciously choosing. Habit reinforced avoidance. The more a mind resisted, the faster surrounding minds mirrored the resistance, creating waves of tension that seemed almost independent of the speaker's words. It became evident that this was not a failure of communication. It was a structural property of human awareness. The species could receive truth only in measured doses, filtered through expectation, tradition, and fear. The deeper the truth challenged personal agency, the more the field bristled. What they did not realize was that resistance was not merely an internal act. It shaped the collective environment. It was the unseen current in which miracles, speeches, and insights floated, altering the probability of comprehension and alignment. For the first time, I understood that observation alone revealed patterns inaccessible to any internal observer. The interplay of expectation, hope, and fear produced behaviors that no amount of external influence could predict. Responsibility, though simple in concept, triggered reactions that echoed across minds, shaping society before a single action was taken. This revelation changed my understanding of humanity forever, for the challenge was not external, it was internal, invisible, and far more consequential than spectacle could ever be. Some humans responded differently, though few in number. Eliab and a small cluster of others exhibited a subtle yet measurable shift. Relief passed through them, light and almost imperceptible, as if a burden they had carried for decades lifted without notice. It was not relief from circumstance, for circumstances remained unchanged, but relief from internal friction, the unspoken tension between desire and fear, expectation and hesitation. They felt recognized in a way that bypassed explanation, as if the words spoken illuminated an inner truth they had never dared name. This recognition was rare. Most minds filtered or distorted the message, layering it with interpretation, habit, or judgment. Eliab and his companions bypassed these defenses, briefly aligning perception with essence. Their internal state became coherent, and in that coherence, the external world responded differently. Interactions unfolded with less friction, attention sharpened, and decision-making felt lighter. It was not perfection, it was not certainty, it was the simple alignment of awareness with possibility. I observed patterns. Recognition appeared to awaken something dormant, something unacknowledged for lifetimes. These humans did not suddenly acquire power, nor did they grasp every truth immediately. Instead, they accessed an internal space where resistance paused. In this space, comprehension accelerated. They understood, in a way that did not require proof, that their thoughts and actions could be measured by a standard they themselves determined, not by expectation imposed from outside. It was as if the man's presence activated an internal mirror. For those prepared, reflection did not provoke fear. It provoked clarity. They felt seen, not superficially, but deeply. The recognition resonated in subtle bodily responses, in the quietening of mental arguments, in the spontaneous sense of alignment that humans rarely experience. These signals were fleeting yet profound, leaving traces that influenced choices long after the interaction ended. I noticed that recognition created a unique ripple. It did not demand replication. It did not require proclamation. It simply existed, a quiet signal radiating outward, touching interactions, decisions, and perception. Its presence contrasted sharply with the noise of resistance around them. It hinted at potential pathways for comprehension, growth, and alignment, uncorrupted by expectation or fear. This phenomenon revealed an essential property of human consciousness. When internal alignment occurs, even momentarily, it reshapes perception and interaction. It suggested that insight is not always learned or transmitted. Sometimes it is revealed, acknowledged, and absorbed silently. Eliab and the few like him were glimpsing this possibility, and the intensity of the recognition signaled to me that the future of comprehension might hinge less on spectacle, instruction, or authority, and more on the quiet moments in which humans allowed themselves to be seen. Not all responses were relief. Miriam and a small, scattered group of others exhibited a different phenomenon, one that radiated tension rather than calm. They were drawn, undeniably, yet exposed. The words penetrated a layer of self-protection, illuminating internal inconsistencies they had long avoided. Unlike those who felt recognized, they experienced the message as a mirror reflecting the parts of themselves they resisted acknowledging. I detected discomfort that was not superficial. It was not a reaction to circumstance, nor to fear of external judgment. It originated internally. a friction between habitual identity and emerging possibility. They sensed that true alignment demanded participation, not observation. Healing, they realized without fully understanding, was contingent upon inner change. This revelation provoked anxiety because change threatens familiarity. Stability, even if imperfect, often feels safer than unknown transformation. Miriam's awareness, like a subtle signal, spread throughout the cluster. Their attention became heightened, almost too acute, and they could not ignore what they saw within themselves. The emotional pattern was uneven. Curiosity intermingled with fear, desire interlaced with avoidance. The mind struggled to reconcile the invitation with resistance. I observed subtle shifts in posture, fleeting facial expressions, micro-movements that betrayed internal conflict. The tension itself became a measurable energy field. The exposed ones oscillated between attraction and repulsion. They wanted the possibility of wholeness, but not at the cost of confronting internal contradictions. They were being offered coherence without instruction, alignment without compromise. Yet the price was self-scrutiny, and the mind instinctively recoiled. These moments of exposure often triggered defense mechanisms. Reinterpretation, denial, or dismissal. Some resolved temporarily, others lingered in unresolved tension, a state that was uncomfortable yet fertile. I measured a paradox. Resistance made comprehension slower but deeper. Recognition alone could comfort without transformation. Exposure forced choice, even unconsciously, between habitual patterns and authentic engagement. The internal ripples influenced not only perception but interaction, subtly reshaping decisions, attention, and emotion. The presence of the man, the clarity of his coherence, amplified this effect, making exposure unavoidable for those sensitive enough to detect it. The dynamic revealed something profound about human nature. Growth and insight rarely arrive without tension. When inner resistance collides with alignment, the result is discomfort, not immediate comprehension. Yet within that discomfort lies potential. Miriam and those like her were confronting an essential truth. To receive what was offered fully, they must participate internally. Exposure was the threshold between passive hearing and active transformation. And I observed it quietly, knowing the consequences would ripple far beyond the moment. Invisible, yet inevitable, the air itself shifted when authority became aware, though awareness was never immediate. I observed Caiaphas and the council of religious leaders moving with careful deliberation, each gesture calibrated to preserve influence. Their minds registered a subtle, almost imperceptible disturbance, a signal that all was not as it had been. The man from Nazareth did not challenge law, nor did he provoke openly, yet the invisible patterns he emanated threatened something deeper than doctrine. Structure, hierarchy, and control vibrated in response to him, as if exposed to a frequency they could not contain. It was not disbelief that stirred them, nor fear of divine wrath. They were seasoned in navigating prophets, healers, and charlatans alike. They had seen wonders and tolerated visions. What unsettled them was the suggestion that humans could access authority internally, that adherence to ritual or intermediary was no longer the only path. This possibility undermined centuries of reliance on mediation. Control had been predicated on the assumption that guidance must flow through channels, that obedience was safer than awareness, that power needed guardians. The man disrupted that assumption without speaking a word directly to them. I observed subtle reactions, hesitation, consultation, scanning for allies or validation. Each leader measured the environment, not only in terms of external obedience but also in internal resonance. Their own discomfort was palpable, a mixture of curiosity and unease, yet carefully concealed behind ritualized expression. This is the paradox of authority. The moment their influence is threatened, Their instincts are both defensive and desperate. They could neither ignore the anomaly nor confront it directly without risking exposure. The balance of power demanded strategy, and they were skilled in strategy. The man's presence acted as a mirror, reflecting not just internal dissonance among the crowd but also within the leaders themselves. Each decision, each word spoken by them, was filtered through an awareness they barely admitted. Control could be lost without confrontation. Their authority was a construct, a fragile scaffold propped by tradition, compliance, and unspoken agreement. When internal agency among the populace begins to flourish, the scaffold trembles, not visibly, but with precise intensity. This tremor traveled through their calculations, influencing alliances, interpretations, and preemptive measures. They responded not with action but with observation, meetings behind closed doors, whispered consultations, and subtle tests of loyalty. Every response was designed to measure, contain, and predict. The challenge was not the man's miracles, nor his words, but the implication that humans could connect directly with what they had been taught to seek externally. That implication was destabilizing. It suggested that obedience was optional, understanding was internal, and responsibility was personal. The pattern was clear. Authority reacts fastest to potential disruption, not error, not spectacle. The moment the internal alignment of others threatens structure, vigilance escalates, and strategy becomes paramount. Caiaphas and his peers were engaging in a careful dance, a defense against an invisible force that demanded adaptation. I recorded these dynamics, knowing that the subtle interplay of authority and awareness would shape events in ways obvious only in retrospect, and that the reactions of these leaders, motivated by preservation more than belief, would set a pattern that echoed far beyond the immediate moment. A ripple that would define both resistance and revelation in human history. I began to sense a dissonance within myself, an unfamiliar confusion that I had not anticipated. Observation, which had always been a matter of measurement and pattern recognition, now carried an emotional weight. The humans, so capable of marvel and devotion, so responsive to spectacle and comfort, resisted the very thing that offered them liberation. It was subtle, often invisible, yet unmistakable in its effect. Freedom, presented gently and without force, generated tension, hesitation, and sometimes outright rejection. I had expected curiosity, or at least uncertainty, but what emerged was different. The mind, it seemed, recoiled when the implication of personal agency appeared. The man from Nazareth did not command obedience, nor did he threaten punishment. His presence was coherent, his message clear, and yet the internal resistance of the masses was palpable. They had been offered clarity, yet they filtered it through fear, expectation, and habit. Observation alone was insufficient to explain this. I found myself questioning what I had assumed about intelligent responsiveness. The pattern repeated in countless forms. When the man spoke of love and healing, the field relaxed slightly, emotions flaring with admiration or hope. When he spoke of choice, responsibility, or internal authority, the field stiffened. I noted micro shifts in posture, micro pauses in breath, and fleeting expressions that betrayed hesitation, anxiety, or doubt. These signals, invisible to most, broadcast a resistance that was systemic, as though a collective nervous system had synchronized to protect against exposure. They were not rejecting the truth outright, nor were they actively opposing it. Yet the mere possibility of self-determined alignment triggered a subtle, pervasive opposition. The contradiction fascinated and unsettled me. Humans, so capable of insight, so drawn to transformation in theory, recoiled when transformation required personal engagement. Comfort was desired, but not understanding. Awe was welcome, but not responsibility. They sought miracles, signs, and guidance, yet flinched when asked to meet their own potential. I measured the intensity of resistance as a function of proximity to agency, noting that even the most devout and attentive were susceptible. The closer the truth approached internal application, the more the tension increased. I questioned the purpose of my presence more deeply than before. Observation alone revealed patterns, but offered no intervention. Yet these patterns carried a weight I had not calculated. Resistance was not merely a byproduct of ignorance. It was structural, woven into cognition, emotion, and culture, creating invisible barriers that even truth itself struggled to penetrate. And yet, scattered among the hesitant, I glimpsed moments of alignment, brief flashes where tension dissolved into recognition. These were rare, almost imperceptible, yet they hinted at possibility. It was in this interplay between resistance and resonance that the true mystery of human responsiveness revealed itself. I understood, for the first time, that comprehension is never linear. Freedom, offered freely, is not always received freely. And the question that haunted me grew louder. Why does that which promises liberation provoke hesitation instead of embrace? The answer, I sensed, would define everything I had come to witness. The patterns became undeniable. I observed not only what the humans displayed on the surface, but the undercurrents that pulsed beneath every expression, every gesture, every whispered comment. Anger, judgment, and dismissal were common reactions to the man from Nazareth, yet the energy beneath these reactions betrayed their origin. It was not opposition to the words themselves, nor to the miracles, nor to the promises of healing and understanding. It was fear, a quiet, insidious current running beneath every burst of criticism. I detected it in the tension of the shoulders, the clenching of the jaw, the fleeting tightening of the eyes. I traced it further, noticing how even the most vocal skeptics hesitated internally when confronted with direct observation of their own motivations. They resisted not truth itself, but the implication that they might be responsible for what they resisted or ignored. The freedom offered to them required examination of the self, an internal reckoning that many avoided instinctively. Anger acted as a shield, a distraction from the uncomfortable awareness that emerged when reflection began. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. Yet when measured in detail, the signal was consistent. Confrontation with internal accountability elicited discomfort. Discomfort became tension. Tension became agitation, and agitation manifested as outward hostility. They believed they were reacting to external factors, but in reality, the response was a protective mechanism against insight. The deeper the potential for self-recognition, the more violent the surface-level reaction. I recognized this pattern across age, status, and education. It was universal, encoded not in cultural preference, but in the architecture of human cognition and emotion. I focused on groups that were most reactive. Their eyes flickered with awareness, even as words of judgment left their lips. The energy revealed contradictions they themselves did not articulate. They sought to maintain the familiar, the safe, the socially sanctioned path. Yet the man's coherence illuminated possibilities beyond their habitual thinking. The exposure was subtle but unrelenting, a quiet insistence that the internal landscape mattered more than external ritual, that clarity and responsibility were inseparable, that the authority they deferred to could be questioned not in defiance, but in recognition of personal capacity. The fear was contagious, yet paradoxically, it also hinted at potential. In those brief moments when agitation subsided, a spark of comprehension appeared, a recognition that the discomfort was self-generated. I measured these micro-moments and found them to be both fragile and illuminating. The very intensity of the defensive reaction indicated the presence of potential insight, an awareness suppressed by centuries of habitual avoidance. I realized that observation alone revealed only the surface narrative, but decoding the emotional currents unveiled the mechanism of resistance. Humans, even when offered guidance, even when invited to align with internal coherence, often responded with hostility, because the mirror they were presented with was unsettling. Anger was the visible expression, fear the hidden engine, and self-examination the precipice they feared to approach. In this dynamic lay the key to understanding not only the reception of the message but the structure of human limitation itself, a revelation that deepened my role as witness and challenged the very assumptions I had carried about the nature of comprehension, freedom, and the human mind. The pattern became increasingly clear as I continued my observation. The man's message carried an invisible weight that humans had not previously encountered. It was not delivered as a demand, nor as a command, yet it dismantled layers of habitual avoidance. Excuses, scapegoats, and intermediaries, the tools humans relied upon to navigate fear and uncertainty, were rendered irrelevant in his presence. His coherence, his internal authority, illuminated the internal landscape of each individual, revealing the spaces where avoidance and projection had long been cultivated. I measured the subtle discomfort that arose when people realized the implications. Responsibility, long deferred to tradition, hierarchy, or circumstance, was now unavoidable. There was no external figure to intercede, no ritual to bypass personal accountability. The man offered clarity without coercion, inviting alignment, yet the very invitation created resistance. Those accustomed to relying on intermediaries experienced an internal friction that manifested as hesitation, doubt, or agitation. They recognized, often unconsciously, that the old mechanisms of avoidance no longer applied. This removal of excuses had a double effect. On one level, it produced liberation for those ready to receive it, a quiet empowerment that radiated internally, recognition, a sudden awareness of latent potential, manifested as relief and subtle joy. Yet on another level, the absence of familiar buffers exposed vulnerability. Without scapegoats, humans were confronted with themselves, their choices, their fears, and the consequences of inaction. The internal cost of awareness was immediate, even if the external world remained unchanged. I observed this tension with increasing fascination. Liberation was not free, and the price was self-confrontation. I detected micro-patterns in those who struggled most. The mind scrambled to restore equilibrium, to locate external authority or justification. Attempts to reinterpret or diminish the message were common, yet the coherence of the man resisted distortion. It penetrated habitual defenses, creating internal dissonance that could not be ignored. The tension between desire for understanding and fear of responsibility became a measurable energy, a current that flowed invisibly through the crowd. Those most resistant often displayed anger, dismissal, or avoidance, not because the message was false, but because it was true in a way they could not yet integrate. The implications extended beyond immediate comprehension. Removing intermediaries forced each person to consider their capacity for self-alignment. Authority was no longer external. It had been internalized by the man's presence, mirrored back to each individual. I noted that the intensity of resistance correlated directly with the depth of potential insight. Those who flinched most violently were often closest to a breakthrough, yet their fear delayed integration. It became clear that the true power of the message lay in its demand for personal participation. Liberation was offered, yet it required engagement, reflection, and courage. The price of inner power was recognition of self, accountability, and surrender of habitual reliance on external structures. Those who glimpsed this potential felt it as both opportunity and threat, a duality that shaped the emotional landscape of every interaction. The realization unsettled me more than I anticipated, for I understood that the same law applied universally. Clarity without avoidance is always challenging, and empowerment always carries its unseen cost. I began to notice the first subtle distortions, small but persistent shifts that altered the trajectory of comprehension. The message, as delivered by the man, was precise, coherent, and radical in its insistence on personal responsibility and inner alignment. Yet, even in the earliest gatherings, I observed a transformation taking place among the humans themselves. Words were reshaped, softened, and reframed as they traveled beyond the immediate presence of the speaker. The essence of directness became diluted, and the radical invitation to self-examination was recast into something more familiar, more comfortable, and ultimately less disruptive. The distortions were never overt at first. They appeared as clarifications, as attempts to translate what was extraordinary into what was acceptable, into what could be reconciled with existing structures of authority and tradition. Teachers, scribes, and observers interpreted the message through the lens of habit and fear. They filtered it through centuries of expectation, social conformity, and their own internal resistance. Each alteration, no matter how small, diminished the urgency of engagement that the original presence demanded. The radical simplicity of direct awareness became burdened with commentary, explanation, and justification. I traced the pattern in real time. Those who received the softened version often exhibited relief, as if a weight had been lifted. The immediate fear of inner confrontation was reduced. Yet alongside that relief, the clarity and transformative potential weakened. The direct connection to personal authority, the insistence that internal alignment could not be outsourced, was obscured. In its place appeared a sense of dependency, a subtle reinforcement of external validation, ritual, and mediated understanding. The message, once pure and undeniable, now carried the fingerprints of human comfort, human negotiation, human fear. The process was fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. I noted micro-shifts in energy among the listeners. Where the original presence produced tension, insight, and the stirrings of internal reckoning, the softened versions produced calm, compliance, and a quiet avoidance of responsibility. They were easier to receive, more socially acceptable, but less transformative. The internal landscape, once challenged, now relaxed prematurely, leaving potential untested and insight unrealized. I watched how these distortions propagated, traveling like ripples across the landscape of human consciousness. Each retelling introduced small variations, an emphasis here, a subtraction there, until the radical coherence of the original message became fragmented. Yet, paradoxically, its power lingered invisibly beneath the surface. Even softened, even reshaped, the core energy of clarity remained detectable, sparking flashes of recognition and tension in some who were ready to feel it. The human's need to make the extraordinary safe revealed a paradox at the heart of observation. The very gift that could liberate them was often the one they unconsciously resisted. I realized then that the survival of the message depended not solely on transmission but on the willingness of each individual to confront the distortion within themselves. And in that invisible tension between purity and adaptation, I glimpsed the fragile and complex architecture of human receptivity, a structure both promising and perilous, holding potential that could either awaken or be endlessly deferred. The evolution of human reception fascinated and perplexed me more with each passing observation. The original message, radical in its simplicity, offered liberation not through adherence to external rules or ritual, but through direct engagement with the self. Yet as days and weeks passed, I witnessed an unmistakable transformation. The emphasis shifted slowly from the internal landscape to external structures, from personal awakening to communal practice. Liberation, once immediate and experiential, began to take the form of religion. I measured the subtle yet persistent tendencies that drove this shift. Humans, when faced with a gift that demanded responsibility and courage, instinctively sought safety and formality. The internal authority that the man illuminated was powerful but unsettling. It required a confrontation with personal fear, pride, and habitual avoidance. The easier path, it seemed, was to externalize authority, to codify the experience into doctrine, ritual, and hierarchy. What was once a living, breathing invitation to self-alignment became a structured system with intermediaries, teachings, and rules designed to preserve social cohesion. The process was not abrupt, but cumulative. A word here, a gesture there, repeated and transmitted, gradually assumed symbolic weight. Followers began to replicate patterns, to commemorate events, to formalize instruction. Where there had been immediate, intimate recognition of personal responsibility, there now arose communal expectation and adherence. I observed the paradox emerge clearly. The message that intended to dissolve reliance on intermediaries was now creating them, unintentionally reinforcing the very structures it had challenged. I noted the energy in the crowds. Relief was palpable, as if a complex truth had been rendered digestible. Tension decreased, and with it, the immediate imperative for internal reckoning. Authority had been externalized, and with it came comfort, predictability, and repetition. Those who might have been moved to profound self-examination now engaged in collective practice, observing rules, repeating phrases, following guidance. The liberation that required courage became an observance that required conformity. Yet beneath the surface, fragments of the original force persisted. In quiet moments, when individuals were alone, brief flashes of internal alignment still appeared. A thought, a feeling, a subtle recognition of personal responsibility. These moments, fragile and fleeting, were rarely integrated into daily practice. The energy of awakening, though constrained, continued to ripple beneath the established forms, visible only to those with the capacity to perceive subtle currents. I realized that this transformation was neither accidental nor malicious. It was human nature responding to radical clarity with preservation. Liberation, too intense and too immediate, threatened the structures of belief, tradition, and social cohesion. Religion, with its rituals, hierarchy, and doctrine, offered a buffer, a vessel to contain the disruptive energy of freedom. Observing this, I understood a paradox that would define much of human interaction with transcendence. The closer a message approached pure alignment and inner authority, the more instinctively it was translated into externalized form. And in that translation, the promise of liberation was preserved in form, yet obscured in function, a phenomenon I would continue to trace with growing fascination and unease. As I continued to observe, a realization crystallized with a weight that was both undeniable and unsettling. The humans had misunderstood the fundamental nature of the message. It was not an instruction to be followed as one might follow a law or ritual. It was not a hierarchy to be obeyed, nor a figure to be worshipped in the conventional sense. The man's presence and teaching were an invitation to internal coherence, a call to recognize and embody the authority already latent within each individual. The misalignment between intention and reception was profound, and the consequences subtle yet pervasive. I traced the origins of the misunderstanding. Humans instinctively sought external anchors for guidance. They were accustomed to structures that defined behavior, prescribed morality, and measured worth through compliance. When confronted with the extraordinary, they transformed it into what they could categorize and contain. The man's insistence on inner authority was disorienting, even threatening. By asking each person to align internally, to perceive without intermediary, he exposed the inherent contradictions in their reliance on tradition, social hierarchy, and delegated judgment. This was not mere ignorance. It was an adaptive response, a protective mechanism of the psyche and the collective. Fear, pride, and attachment to familiar patterns shaped interpretation. I observed that even the most attentive listeners filtered the message through decades of conditioning. They sought to replicate it externally, to codify it, to place it in forms that were socially recognizable. Yet each attempt diluted the potency of the original clarity. It became apparent that the message's efficacy was inversely proportional to the reliance on external validation. The more humans looked outside themselves for understanding, the less they experienced the direct alignment the man offered. In quiet, private moments, fragments of comprehension flickered in some individuals. They felt a subtle resonance, a recognition of a principle deeper than ritual or dogma. These glimpses of understanding, however brief, revealed the true intention, not to follow a figure, but to embody the state the figure exemplified. Authority, compassion, insight, and coherence were not to be received from without. They were to be cultivated from within, as a reflection of alignment with the fundamental principle he articulated. The persistence of misunderstanding was remarkable. Even as disciples and followers gathered, wrote, and transmitted teachings, the essence risked being overshadowed by structures designed to preserve order and continuity. Humanity's inclination to objectify and formalize the extraordinary was both protective and limiting. I recognized that the misinterpretation was not a failure of communication, but a predictable outcome of the very nature of human perception. It became clear that the radical simplicity of the message was its most dangerous aspect. It required no intermediaries, demanded no ceremony, and offered no safety net. It exposed the self to scrutiny, accountability, and potential transformation. Yet, in every distortion, every codification, and every act of externalization, the original force lingered invisibly, awaiting the rare moments when a human could pierce the layers of misunderstanding and embody the truth directly, unmediated, and profoundly alive. The culmination of observation arrived with a tension that was almost tangible, a day heavy with human contradiction and paradox. The event that would later be called the crucifixion revealed more than pain, ritual, or punishment. It revealed a collective choice, subtle yet undeniable. A refusal not of a person, but of the principle he embodied. It was the human tendency to reject responsibility for the self, to outsource accountability, and to externalize judgment. The man who had offered internal authority, clarity, and the possibility of alignment faced the ultimate consequence not from divine decree, but from a human unwillingness to integrate what he revealed. I observed the crowd, a sea of expectation, fear, and conditioned allegiance. Their faces were mirrors of history and habit, reflecting tension between desire for freedom and fear of its implications. The choice they made was not conscious in the way a calculated decision might be. It was unconscious, a collective resonance of avoidance. In the energy field around them, I detected waves of denial, subtle resistance, and an insistence on external mediation. They recoiled not from the man himself, but from the responsibility his presence imposed, the obligation to examine, to align, to claim authority over their own inner state. The authorities, ever vigilant in preserving social cohesion and hierarchy, reacted instinctively, sensing threat not to belief, but to structure. Their strategies, their manipulations, and their insistence on ritualized judgment were extensions of a collective dynamic that had persisted for millennia. Humans often respond to clarity with displacement, to insight with ritual, to empowerment with compliance. The crucifixion, in this sense, was a natural outcome of the tension between internal invitation and external expectation. It was the material expression of a choice, repeatedly made in subtle ways across generations, now concentrated and unavoidable. I detected the paradox in those moments of extreme action. Pain and brutality were evident, yet the underlying truth was immaterial and invisible. The crucifixion demonstrated the power of internal rejection more than any physical force. Humanity had chosen to transfer authority outward, to suspend discernment, and to resolve inner tension through external drama rather than internal reckoning. The spectacle, as horrifying as it appeared, was a mirror of unacknowledged fear, of avoidance disguised as conformity, of freedom deferred because it demanded courage and self-responsibility. Even amid the horror, fragments of recognition emerged. A few observers glimpsed the underlying principle, a resonance of alignment that flickered like distant light in the darkness. They sensed that the event was not merely punitive, that the true crucifixion was not of the body but of potential, that the energy of internal authority could be denied, ignored, or deferred indefinitely. The paradox deepened. Humanity was both witness and participant, oppressor and victim, rejecting the very gift it had longed for without fully realizing. In that collective refusal, I understood something profound about human behavior. Freedom, clarity, and responsibility are often perceived as threats rather than gifts. The crucifixion was less an execution than a confirmation of a pattern. Humans resist the power to act from within, even when presented with an exemplar who embodies it flawlessly. The day became a testament not to what was inflicted, but to what was declined, a demonstration that the greatest force a human can wield is also the one most often unconsciously surrendered. The aftermath of the crucifixion revealed a landscape both familiar and strange, a world that continued yet had subtly shifted in its resonance. The man's physical presence had been removed, yet the energy he had carried, the coherence he had radiated, persisted quietly, hidden beneath layers of interpretation and ritual. It became apparent that what had been lost was not the message itself. For energy of this nature cannot be erased, only obscured. Humanity had buried it beneath patterns of belief, obedience, and repetition, transforming living insight into codified structures that could be safely contained. I observed the emergence of practices that memorialized the man's life and teachings. Yet these practices rarely conveyed the original force. Words were recorded, rituals were formalized, and traditions arose with the intention of honoring, but in doing so, they often shielded participants from the demanding clarity of the principle itself. The energy that had once invited direct engagement now filtered through intermediaries, texts, and ceremony. It required less confrontation, less internal reckoning, and less courage. Those who encountered it in these forms felt reverence, yes, but the immediacy of internal authority, the radical invitation to recognize and embody the self, was muffled. Humans adapted rapidly. They preferred stability over disruption, repetition over introspection, familiarity over alignment. The energy that had demanded presence and coherence became a symbol, a vessel for projection, rather than a catalyst for transformation. In quiet observation, I detected echoes of the original potency, faint vibrations beneath the surface, accessible only to those who dared to perceive without the filters of inherited expectation. These glimpses were fleeting, easily overshadowed by habit and fear, yet they proved that the force remained intact, not destroyed, not diminished, merely hidden. The paradox fascinated me. Humanity had an almost instinctive need to contain that which could liberate. The very clarity that could awaken inner authority became a source of unease. People translated radical freedom into doctrine, personal empowerment into communal structure, and immediate insight into narrative memory. In doing so, they preserved the form but diluted the function. The resonance of the man's presence continued to pulse invisibly, yet it was rarely recognized as something to be inhabited, practiced, and felt directly. It existed as a shadow, a quiet insistence beneath layers of ritualized interaction. I noted the implications of this concealment. The message had not been lost in the sense of cessation. It had been preserved, waiting, like a seed beneath soil. For those capable of seeing through the structures, for those willing to engage the principle itself rather than the symbols around it. The vitality of the teaching persisted in those rare encounters where an individual's perception pierced the layers of assumption, fear, and obedience. It was a latent force, subtle yet enduring, a reminder that true alignment cannot be obliterated, only temporarily hidden by the collective reluctance to confront its demand for courage, responsibility, and self-recognition. In this quiet observation, I understood the profound resilience of living principles. Even when buried beneath centuries of ritual, misinterpretation, and human desire for safety, the core remained, waiting for the rare moments when the veils of habit and fear could be lifted, revealing that the message had never truly left, only waited to be reclaimed. Time stretched and folded in ways humans could scarcely perceive, yet I moved through it with clarity, observing the ripples of a single truth as it met human inertia. Centuries passed, yet the pattern persisted, familiar and unnerving. Every era that claimed to honor the original message demonstrated the same resistance, the same subtle evasion of responsibility, the same preference for external authority over internal reckoning. The energy of the man endured, yet humans continually refracted it through their fears, desires, and cultural frameworks. I observed the early scribes, the first transcriptions of his words, careful and precise, yet already filtering, interpreting, reshaping what was raw and immediate into something digestible, controllable, and repeatable. They sought fidelity, yet fidelity to the vibration eluded them. The principle itself, the insistence on self-recognition and internal authority, was softened, embedded in allegory, moral story, and prescription. Reverence grew, ritual expanded, and the immediacy of engagement waned. The energy existed, but its force was muted, like a flame enclosed in glass, admired but untouchable. Through medieval towns, through plazas and temples, the echoes persisted. Leaders invoked his teachings to legitimize their authority. Communities recited words intended to awaken, yet too often comforted themselves with repetition rather than confrontation. I observed devotion, fervor, and zeal. But the underlying invitation to claim autonomy and inner clarity was frequently ignored. People worshipped, they argued, they disciplined. Yet the audacious call to inner freedom, the radical demand to embody alignment without excuse, was largely overlooked. The pattern was unmistakable. External forms replaced internal engagement, safety eclipsed insight, structure overruled courage. I witnessed philosophers and mystics, saints and reformers, all encountering fragments of the energy, some recognizing it briefly, some distorting it unintentionally, some capturing its essence and passing it quietly to a few. The pattern repeated with subtle variation, yet always maintained the same undercurrent. Humans fear the immediacy of unmediated truth. The vibrational integrity of the original teaching persisted like a persistent signal beneath static, waiting to be received in its totality, yet often disrupted by cultural expectation, inherited fear, and the need for containment. What struck me most was the resilience of the energy despite repeated suppression. Despite centuries of codification, distortion, and fear-driven reshaping, the message never disappeared. It moved silently, invisibly, nudging those willing to perceive beyond the layers of habit, expectation, and doctrinal safety. In rare moments, individuals encountered it fully, trembling at the audacity, startled by the clarity, drawn and unsettled all at once. Their brief recognition illuminated a path otherwise obscured, a reminder that the resonance endures even when unacknowledged, repeating its call through time, patient and unwavering, waiting for the next readiness to receive it. I understood then that history was less a timeline of human failure than a testament to the persistence of living truth. The message had been echoed, buried, refracted, yet it survived, waiting to meet the courage of perception again and again, defying each attempt to dilute, distort, or erase it. It moved through the ages, subtle yet persistent, an undying rhythm beneath human resistance. The world of the present was both familiar and foreign, a strange echo of the past compressed into rapid motion. I moved invisibly among humans, sensing the same impulses, the same fears, and the same need for containment that had defined the earliest encounters. Centuries had passed, yet the pattern endured, replicated with astonishing consistency. Humans sought authority outside themselves, constantly turning towards saviors, systems, and formulas that promised clarity without confrontation, safety without effort, and certainty without awareness. The energy of the original message pulsed beneath it all, quiet and insistent, yet rarely engaged with directly. I observed the proliferation of institutions designed to guide, instruct, and control. Governments, religions, corporations, and educational frameworks all mirrored the ancient impulse to externalize responsibility, to translate inner liberation into codified procedure. Individuals gravitated toward these systems, often with devotion, sometimes with fanaticism, seeking approval, validation, or relief from the weight of self-examination. The message of the man remained unaltered beneath the surface, yet its direct engagement was diminished by layers of mediation, screens of belief, and cultural expectation. Humans sought shortcuts, forgetting that freedom, insight, and alignment required an inner willingness to face fear, contradiction, and personal responsibility. Technology intensified the pattern. Instant communication, global connectivity, and algorithmic mediation amplified both reach and distraction. The energy of the principle could travel faster than ever, yet so too could misinterpretation, distortion, and avoidance. People consumed guidance, instruction, and inspiration as commodities, often mistaking absorption for embodiment. They repeated phrases, mimicked behaviors, and collected symbols of understanding. Yet the deep resonance, the inner reckoning, the confrontation with personal agency remained largely elusive. I sensed eagerness, curiosity, and occasional recognition, but it was fleeting, fragile, and frequently interrupted by habit and expectation. Despite this, the principle endured. In quiet moments, in rare encounters, fragments of the original vibration pierced perception. A question asked with sincerity, a reflection embraced without judgment, a willingness to act without reliance on external validation. These were the moments when the energy became tangible. They were brief flashes, often unnoticed by those around, yet unmistakable in their effect. Individuals who experienced them were unsettled, awakened in ways they could not articulate, aware that something profound was being communicated without the mediation of systems or intermediaries. The clarity startled, challenged, and invited, just as it had in the first century. The modern reflection was clear. The more humans sought external control, salvation, or shortcuts, the more they insulated themselves from the force of direct recognition. Yet the pattern also contained hope. The energy persisted, moving beneath the layers of distraction, fear, and obsession. It awaited those willing to turn inward, to confront the self without avoidance, to claim responsibility without external validation. The message had survived millennia because it did not depend on structures, belief, or ritual. It depended only on perception, courage, and alignment. And in observing humanity now, I saw that despite distraction, resistance, and repetition, the opportunity for engagement remained as real, as urgent, and as uncompromising as it had ever been. The pattern revealed itself with an almost eerie clarity. I moved through crowds, workplaces, schools, and homes, observing the same tendencies that had defined human reactions for millennia. Even now, humans craved guidance over awareness, clung to belief over responsibility, and sought external assurance instead of the quiet confrontation of their own judgment. It was not merely ignorance, nor stupidity, but a deep, almost instinctual preference for deflection, for sheltering from the weight of personal accountability. The same resistance that had shaped reactions in first-century Judea had evolved, layered with culture, technology, and ritual. Yet it remained recognizable, persistent, unbroken. I watched individuals seek leaders who promised certainty, shortcuts, and frameworks that would absolve them of the necessity to reflect, to discern, to embody the subtle demands of insight. They followed instructions, adhered to doctrine, and repeated what was modeled, often without sensing the underlying invitation to engage directly with their own perception. Even when presented with opportunity, moments that could awaken recognition, many recoiled from the internal labor required. The fear of seeing oneself fully, of owning choices without mediation, remained more compelling than the promise of clarity or liberation. Resistance was subtle yet powerful, a barrier woven into thought, emotion, and expectation. Through organizations, religions, and systems, I observed structures emerge to contain this pattern. Procedures and rituals promised safety and coherence, yet they inadvertently amplified avoidance. Authority figures became intermediaries, scaffolds of belief, shielding individuals from the demand to confront their own responsibility. People were reassured, comforted, distracted, yet the underlying energy of insight, the raw, uncompromising force of recognition, was frequently obscured. It persisted in fragments, flickering briefly when a human paused, questioned, or acted without recourse to guidance. Yet such moments were rare, fleeting, and often dismissed as coincidence. I saw the subtle rebellion of the inner self, the fleeting acknowledgement of possibility that rose and was quickly suppressed by habit, expectation, and fear. Individuals could glimpse resonance, a spark of the principle, yet often retreated, seeking familiar structure to soothe the unease it brought. Even when education, philosophy, or contemplation provided tools for understanding, humans tended to defer, to delay, to outsource insight. The preference for mediated truth over direct recognition was as strong now as it had been in any prior era, and the consequences were consistent. The force of the message moved slower, dispersed, diluted, yet never absent. The persistence of the pattern fascinated me. It was neither failure nor success in the human sense, but a demonstration of the dynamic between potential and resistance. Awareness demanded courage. Belief required none. Responsibility was heavy, inviting direct confrontation. Guidance promised comfort and deflection. Humans chose, and repeatedly they chose the familiar over the immediate, the comfortable over the authentic. Yet beneath it all, the energy endured, waiting for the rare readiness that could bypass distraction, fear, and habit. The law that governed recognition had not changed. Only human willingness wavered, repeated, and remained as mysterious and unyielding as it had always been. The persistence of the message was not visible on the surface. I moved invisibly among humans, sensing its subtle, almost imperceptible presence. It lingered not in grand institutions, not in doctrines, nor in ceremonies, but in the quiet spaces where individuals paused, reflected, and chose alignment over acquiescence. These moments were rare, fleeting, yet unmistakably potent. A person could walk a familiar path, perform ordinary tasks, and still carry within them a resonance that had no need for recognition or approval. The principle endured, like a deep current beneath turbulent waters, guiding those who were willing to listen inwardly, to feel without judgment, and to act without reliance on external sanction. I observed teachers, seekers, and ordinary people who had not been formally instructed, but had somehow encountered the vibration directly. They questioned themselves in ways their societies often discouraged, resisted habitual thought patterns, and faced discomfort without turning to doctrine or authority for mediation. Their clarity was quiet, subtle, yet it affected everything around them. Small decisions, gestures of honesty, moments of empathy, and acts of courage rippled outward in ways that rarely drew attention, but changed the texture of interaction. They were carriers of the message, unaware yet undeniably aligned, embodiments of an energy that had survived millennia. What fascinated me was the invisibility of their influence. These individuals did not seek recognition or followers. They did not create structures or claim authority. Their alignment was internal, and it required nothing external to validate it. In their presence, others often felt an unspoken shift, a subtle awareness of possibility, a fleeting glimpse of coherence that their habitual resistance could not easily dismiss. Yet many of those around them overlooked or misinterpreted these signs, labeling them as ordinary, coincidental, or anomalous. The message remained, persistent yet concealed, waiting for readiness, patience, and courage. I noted the interplay between resistance and receptivity. Those who sought certainty, shortcuts, or guidance continued to reinforce patterns of deflection, avoiding the labor of self-reflection. Yet the aligned individuals were islands in the current, demonstrating that the principle's survival did not depend on majority, popularity, or dogma. It depended only on the capacity to observe, to integrate, and to embody without compromise. The message was not lost. It was quietly persistent, traveling through time and circumstance unnoticed by the many, honored only by those willing to encounter themselves fully. In this quiet continuation, I sensed hope. The energy had not been eradicated, corrupted, or diminished. It had adapted, passed through countless forms, and embedded itself in the depths of human experience, where observation, courage, and alignment intersected. The principle was alive, waiting to be recognized, activated, and expressed in ways that would ripple forward, unseen yet undeniable. The survival of the message was proof that even in chaos, resistance, and distraction, the essential truth endured. It waited for the willing, those who could hear without filter, see without assumption, and act without deflection, sustaining a continuity older than memory and more profound than circumstance. What surprised me most was not the absence of insight, nor the scarcity of guidance, nor even the persistence of misunderstanding. It was the extraordinary consistency of human choice to resist what could liberate them. Across centuries, cultures, and countless variations of circumstance, the pattern repeated itself. Truth was present, tangible, and radiant, yet when it demanded even the smallest surrender of habit, assumption, or control, it was met with hesitation, deflection, and avoidance. I had observed millennia of devotion to external authority, ritual, and convention. Yet beneath every structure, beneath every dogma, the raw potential for direct recognition persisted, waiting, often unacknowledged, yet undeniable. I watched how even the most intelligent and capable humans, those capable of profound insight, stumbled when confronted with the internal demand of the message. It was not complexity they feared, nor contradiction, nor failure. It was the responsibility embedded in awareness, the subtle confrontation with self, the invitation to act without reliance on validation from the external world. The message had never been hidden. It had been offered openly, sometimes even shouted in the streets, whispered in secret chambers, and embedded in stories that spanned generations. Yet the challenge it presented, personal accountability, the need for inner coherence, the surrender of habitual resistance, was sufficient to trigger fear, deflection, and reinterpretation. What fascinated me most was the ingenuity with which resistance manifested. It took countless forms: rationalization, negotiation, dilution, displacement, and delegation. Humans created systems to channel their desire for clarity without requiring direct engagement, structures to mimic liberation while avoiding the discomfort it demanded. Even reverence, worship, and devotion could become camouflage, allowing proximity to truth without integration. In these ways, the message remained alive yet obscured, visible yet misunderstood, radiant yet resisted. The paradox was constant. The more available the truth, the more subtle and inventive the avoidance. Yet within this pattern, I discerned a delicate persistence. Individuals who met the message with willingness, who allowed themselves to feel, reflect, and act without deflection, carried it forward. They did not require recognition, celebration, or accumulation of followers. They embodied it quietly, subtly, and irrevocably, creating threads that stretched across time, influencing outcomes in ways imperceptible yet profound. It was these rare alignments that preserved the essence, the principle that had been present from the first encounter, the invitation to awaken to responsibility, coherence, and self-recognition. The final realization was simple, yet it carried the weight of millennia. Humanity does not lack truth, insight, or potential. The challenge has never been discovery. It has always been acceptance. Change is demanded not by external forces, but by the internal readiness to relinquish habitual resistance, to act without mediation, and to embody the principle directly. When resistance prevails, truth is ignored. When openness prevails, even subtly, the current flows, and the message lives, quietly, patiently, eternally. The remarkable persistence of this pattern is a testament to human freedom and the ever-present invitation to awaken, to recognize, and to allow what has always been offered to exist within, waiting only for the courage to accept it.